I'd like to introduce Dorothy Keene, who has worked with Dr. Sonenshein at I keep saying UCLA because that's my alma mater. At Cal State LA, Dorothy.
I forgive you, Marge. It's my honor and privilege to introduce my colleague from my home campus, Cal State LA, and that's Raphael Sonenshein. We all know him on the campus. He's seen running around all the time, getting people energized to be concerned about our government and to be concerned about political issues. Rafe comes to us with a great academic record. He went to Princeton for his bachelor's. He got his master's and his Ph.D. at Yale. He is the, I want to make sure I get it right, the executive director of the Pat Brown Institute for Public Affairs, which is housed at Cal State LA. But most of all, I think his greatest credential is his personality. He is able to take the crazy things happening in the electoral process today, and he's able to break them down into little bites so we all get it. And today, we're so delighted because he has an answer to our question, and that is, okay, so they registered to vote. Now, how do we get them to vote? Rafe.
Thank you very much. Let me grab my word. Hello, everybody. I've been told that I can't take this microphone out of here and go walking around, which is my normal thing. I suffer, those of you who know Yiddish, I suffer from a condition called Spilkus, which in Yiddish means ants in your pants, which is I can't stand still. So this is going to be an unusual thing for me, but I'm going to give it my best shot. It's wonderful to be here with my friends in the League of Women Voters, who are my friends, my colleagues, my soul sisters and brothers for so many years in politics. I've been at the Pat Brown Institute for 5 years and gave us a new motto, which is unleashing the power of participation. And that's what we're all about there. And as soon as I got there, I realized that I had to reach out to my friends in the League of Women Voters, and we began hosting debates together. And in 2013, we hosted mayoral debates that were televised. And the executive director of the LA League was Raphael, and we worked so well together that I stole her from the League, and she's now been the associate director at the Pat Brown Institute for more than 3 years. She couldn't join us today, but wanted me to say hello to all of you who know her and know her work. It is great work to be in the business of getting people energized in the civic arena. We live in a period that is so intense that we are either all going to die or we're going to be more energized than we've ever been in our lives, or perhaps both. I get up every morning and I think this may be the day we go to some kind of a global war. And then in the afternoon I think, boy, this is a great time to get people to vote because everybody's upset, wild, crazy, happy, sad. So, I mean, I live on the edge in politics with this kind of stuff, so we're living on the edge right now. I am here to tell you I don't have the answer to your question. I have answers. How to get people to vote is what in social science they refer to as an overdetermined result. There are so many things that move the needle that you start to think maybe you need a cocktail of all of them to make it work. I'm also here to tell you that what you're doing is working fine, but just needs more stuff. I know when I had some conversations about this, people said, are we doing the right thing at the League? Are you kidding? Of course you're doing the right thing at the League. But I want to tell you what some of the newer research is showing about voting, what colleges are doing about voting, and just see what you might want to add to your arsenal. But I believe you should never bet against the League of Women Voters. I am reminded what Joseph Stalin said about the Pope. Thank you. You know, I come from the Borscht Belt of the East Coast, where you always needed somebody in the audience to say, "So, Henny Youngman, what did Joseph Stalin say?" He was asked about something the Pope had said that was very critical of Stalin, and he said, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" Which, by the way, showed how little Joseph Stalin knew. which is that there's such a thing as moral authority. You don't need weapons, you don't need arms if you stand for something. So when someone says, how many divisions does the League of Women Voters have, I say, they're like the Pope. And I'll tell you a case study some of you probably participated in. A few years ago, I was given the dubious task of creating a debate on the 710 freeway expansion. Remember that one? And we were going to host it on campus. They said, well, let Rafe do it. It'll be fine. No big problem. I'm thinking, oh, great. So campus security had heard that we were probably going to have like mass violence in the room. So they showed up and I said, don't worry about it. We're co-hosting it with the League of Women Voters. It'll be fine. And we posted the League of Women Voters. Was anybody in that group at that event? Do you remember? And everybody came loaded for bear. They were going to have their signs. And we said, oh, the League says no signs. So people said, okay. And then they stood in the aisle like this. And I said, if you have questions, just ask the League. Pass your card over to the League volunteers. And they looked over and they said, okay. And after about 10 minutes, the campus security went on to something more worrisome. You know, there was a cat in a tree or something like that. And we had a wonderful event, and people came up afterward and said, I really learned a lot. I heard what the other side had to say. And I thought the Pope didn't need divisions. There was respect for the League's role. So don't ever be down on yourselves about what you've got. In this world where nobody respects anybody's point of view, I would say the League respects everybody's point of view. Now, that being said, we're in big trouble in voting participation in Southern California, especially in LA County. And I'm on a mission about this. I call this my 31 project. In 2014, the voter turnout in Los Angeles County was 31%. A quarter of all registered voters in California are in LA County. One of the 58 counties has more than a quarter of all registered voters, 31%. That was substantially below the second lowest county of the 58. In the Bay Area, the turnout was way higher, which is one reason that every couple of years when there's a statewide election, the Bay Area politicians get together and say, whose turn is it now? And they don't much take into account Southern California in that. Our turnout is dreadful and it's getting worse. And it's particularly bad in midterm elections, which is a phenomenon across the whole country. And it is, sadly, a lot of it is being driven by young voters not participating in midterm elections or in any election in which Barack Obama is not on the ballot. So I would say your first rule is to get rid of the two-term limit and have Barack Obama run every 4 years for the rest of our lives. Then we could all, instead of having breakfast, go get drunk and go do something else because the problem would be solved. It's a big problem of American politics that people think the president controls everything, so you might as well just vote in the presidential election and then blow off that little thing called Congress, the state legislatures, redistricting, voting rights that are being threatened throughout the country, fortunately not in California, but in major parts of the country. All of that's determined in the midterm elections, and it's a real challenge. So 31% project. And oddly enough, not oddly enough, two communities have been lagging, which is Latinos and Asian Americans. And before you think that's as a result of alienation, you might want to know that those are two of the most optimistic communities in the state of California. By the way, you know who are the most pessimistic voters in California? Older white voters. But younger people coming out of immigrant communities are very hopeful about the future. People don't know that. It's a great piece of data. The question, though, is how do you translate that into voting? And there's a lot of things that would have been done 100 years ago in politics that aren't being done anymore that I think we are starting to reconnect with a little bit about how to not just get people to vote. I'm very good at making people feel guilty. My kids are terrified not to vote. They will vote for the mosquito abatement district because they know how angry I'll be because I'll say, so who did you choose? You know? But you can only go so far with just your own kids. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what we know now about voter engagement, and it's changing a lot. I'll tell you about two places you might want to look at. One is Tufts University, outside Boston in Medford, has done wonderful work on voter participation. This is their thing. Tufts University has really pioneered in all, including, by the way, in neighborhood participation, but now in voting. They are working with 800 colleges and universities around the country to survey voting by students and to see what they find about what makes a difference. At Yale University, a couple of political scientists have done research, very clever research, on what motivates people to vote. I want to tell you what the second one found first, and then I really want to get to my main point. What they found at Yale is that shame works, which, being Jewish, is a wonderful thing to find out. I was always wondering, when would all this guilt be useful? And it has turned out that my time has finally come. They did a wonderful study where they had a whole bunch of voters, and they sent one group got information, which you might call our approach, the sort of general one. There's an election. You may want to go vote. You should vote. Then they sent the other group of people sort of a more guilt-inducing thing about how you haven't voted in the past, because everybody's voting record is public, which people don't realize. They think the CIA gave, or the Russians gave you the information. It's actually right at the polling place. And the third group was told not only their own voting record, but their neighbor's voting record. And the third one had the biggest impact. The second one had a big impact. People get embarrassed when they find out that their neighbors voted and they didn't. And they go and vote. Now, these scholars had a bit of a sense of humor. There's a footnote in one of the studies where they point out that it has a bit of blowback because the people who voted and were shamed into it were angry at that. And when they got the next mailing, wrote back and said, "Please remove me from this list." And in fact, one candidate a few years ago misused this research and sent out a really vicious letter to people, calling them names for not voting and saying how worthless they were and all this. And it really, you can overdo the shame thing. There is a point to all this, though. Voting is not a simple act. And it's not an individual act. Voting is a social act. And that, to me, is the great secret of voter participation that we are starting to rediscover. Politics on the East Coast, where I grew up 100 years ago, was entirely a social event. In fact, the great genius of the rise of the Irish American community in Boston, New York, and all the cities on the East Coast was to treat politics as a social act. And even before that, the most important political figure in the Wild West in California was the saloon keeper, because everybody came to talk politics. Then it became the barber shop, which is a social place to talk about everything that's out there. We tend to do retail when we need to be doing wholesale. We go one voter at a time. We've been trained to be individuals in politics. We're actually very much social animals. I get an absentee ballot and I never fill it out because I like to walk down to the precinct and hang out with the people and have a donut, and the people look so depressed because nobody's shown up for 4 hours, and I come and I stay, and I just like it. I like standing in line with the other people. So, but that just tells you something about the way people think about politics. Politics is a human social activity, and your vote is a collective vote. And I tell my students, although sometimes it backfires, your vote actually doesn't matter. How do you like that one? Is it a nice thing to say in front of the League of Women Voters of Pasadena? I live on the edge, as I said. Your individual vote doesn't matter. And I hate the argument that there was a tie vote in Phoenix for assessor that was 5-4, so the vote really mattered. Actually, that's ridiculous. In fact, I'm going to explain to you why your vote matters in California. People say my vote doesn't matter because the state always votes Democratic in the presidential election. Of course it matters. The reason it doesn't matter is because the California voters made a collective majority decision to matter. Your vote doesn't matter. What matters is if people like you vote. And thirdly, if people like you vote and if people in power know that people like you vote. Now that gets through to them because I say to my students, people in politics don't think students vote. So even if you vote, if they still think people like you don't vote, they don't care, because they don't think they should care. You need not just to vote as an individual, you need to vote as a group, and you need to get a reputation for voting as a group. Those three things are where voting power really operates. So drop this whole thing about the tie vote, Bush versus Gore. Oh, really? That was decided in the Supreme Court, not by who voted that day. It was whose vote was actually counted that day, which is a slightly different question. It's a silly argument to say you have to prove to everybody that they should only vote if they're landslides count. What if you're part of the collective that gave 61% to Lyndon Johnson in 1964, and not long after that, the Voting Rights Act was passed? You were part of that. because you were part of a landslide, not because it was decided by one vote. It's meaningless. Now think about the fact that if you begin to think of voting as a social act, two things change for you. One is you begin to follow the Willie Sutton rule. Everybody remember Willie Sutton, that great philosopher? Bank robber, who was asked why he robs banks. And what was the answer? Thank you. I knew you'd all know it, because that's where the money is. If politics is social, you don't get up in the morning and find one person to talk to. You find out where the money is, which is where people gather, and then you either create the gathering or you go to the gathering. I'm not telling you anything you don't know about this. And it means making some, I think, sad choices. Let me tell you about young people. You are better off starting with college campuses than, quote, young people in general. And we know there's two reasons for that. One is that young people don't vote, but young people in college are far more likely to vote than young people who are not in college. I think that's a very serious problem for our country. Now, until we find where those young people who didn't go to college are congregating, the first step to get youth voting up is to go to the college campuses where they got nothing to do all day except, study and take tests and do other things that I don't want to talk about. The laws have changed. So basically, college campuses are now a major hotbed of voter mobilization because they finally discovered that we've got them. We've got their email addresses. We've got contact information. We can send an email to every one of our 28,000 students at Cal State LA like that. So think about it, 28,000 at a time or one at a time? What's the better plan? Go where they are, go to the campuses. So my campus, a couple of years ago, joined this Tufts consortium. And Tufts is funny. They send every campus a report card about how their students did in terms of voting in the last election. Very, very college-y, In 2012, we were below the average for all colleges in the United States in terms of the presidential election student. Well, we went hog wild. I spent yesterday emailing all the people on campus and told them I was coming to talk to you. They said, really, you're talking to the League of Women Voters? They were a little intimidated. But anyway, they thought that was great. I said, what did you do? And I got emails that were like this long about everything they did between 2012 and 2016. They sent out waves of emails to every student. The ASI, the Associated Students, organized events with food and with music, and they made a party out of it. We did our U.S. Senate debate. We had the only U.S. Senate debate in California and, with the League of Women Voters of California and ABC TV. And we asked the students to organize a viewing party upstairs, which was way more fun than the debate. They had the radio station there, they had music, they were screaming at the screen, they were insulting the candidates. It was very democratic. And especially when Loretta Sanchez did a dab at the end of it, which, being an old guy, I thought she was just having a physical problem. I didn't realize that she was actually doing something that my daughter wrote to me and said, my God, you're viral. I said, I'm feeling okay. Turned out it had gone worldwide. But the students were having a ball. 250 students were having the best. Thank you, I feel much better. I am not going to do it because every time I do it, my kids laugh at me because I do it completely wrong. At the end of the debate, Loretta Sanchez, could anybody dab? There. Okay, that's not bad. That's better than anything I did. And I'm asking questions. I'm 10 feet away, and I'm thinking she's like really off the edge. I don't know what she's going like this. It's supposed to be a football move when you get into the end zone to show. And I thought she was just mad at Mark Brown, who was the moderator. But the point of this, there's always a point if you wait long enough. The point, just be patient. It comes around on the guitar eventually. Is that the students upstairs were having the time of their lives, and it was unforgettable. Well, they were organizing debates during the election. They were organizing events on campus. Everywhere I looked, there was something going on. There was one group of faculty that was getting them health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, and while they're there, making sure they were registering to vote. That's throughout the Cal State system. Well, when 2016 came around, our campus exceeded the national average of voter participation by about 6 points. And I asked them what they learned, and they said, you just got to make this stuff engaging. I mean, what we call voter engagement is rarely engaging. I mean, honestly, look, it's just us chickens here, right? The stuff that I'm a nerd, that I love, I'll read ballot arguments, They said, make it engaging. Make the students part of it. Make the students be ambassadors to other students, right? And they did that. And now we're planning for 2018, and I'm on my new project. My project's called the 2018 project. I'm just naming it right now. I'm using the 31% baseline from 2014, and I want that to be 45 or 50% in LA. I want LA to scream, LA County to scream. But the only way you can get there is by gobbling up big territory. Find out where the people are. I'll tell you another place people are is at PTA meetings. We did a poll of registered voters in LA County, and we surveyed Latino registered voters, and we divided them into foreign-born, native-born, Spanish-speaking, English-speaking, and in every measure of participation except one, we found that the native-born English speakers outweighed the foreign-born Spanish speakers. And you know what the great equalizer was? Participating in PTA meetings. If you want to get to everybody who's hard to reach, everybody is in the PTA. They're like the new League of Women Voters, the Junior League of Women Voters. It's not really. But you think about it, it hits you where you live. You may not go to any meeting, but the meeting about your kids at school is the one that you're not going to miss. So go to the PTA meetings. I know you're already doing it. I know even PTA was mentioned in the note that I got from Marge about this. So again, I'm preaching to the choir on this. But I will say what's going on the college campuses is tremendously exciting. In Texas, they actually organized an event that was loads of fun at one of the universities, and then they marched everybody down to the polling place to vote together. Hundreds of people went down there and voted, and they looked back and the voting turnout had gone up. This stuff is social. And that is, I think, to keep doing everything you're doing. But try to realize that this doesn't have to be dreary work. This is not a duty and an obligation, although I think it is. And I'm not against saying that it's a duty and an obligation to vote, but it's also part of making your voice heard. Now, which takes us into the world we're in today. This loony world we're in today, which, by the way, I don't know, my nerve endings are on edge. It's great and terrible. I have, by the way, learned to moderate my news watching. I've gone my whole life without high blood pressure, which sadly runs in my family. And the odds are pretty good I should have high blood pressure, but until this year I never actually worried about it. Now I can actually feel it. And you're not supposed to be able to feel it, but if I'm watching too much news, so I have all kinds of little tricks that I highly recommend to you. Number one is most of what's going on is not actually happening. No, that's not like a Zen thing. What I mean is there's more talk than action going on. And I've lived through so many presidential administrations, most of which are more action than talk. This one is about 95% what I'm about to do, possibly next week. Do you remember Wimpy's, the guy from the hamburger thing? Give me a hamburger today and I will gladly pay you Tuesday. Is that Wimpy?
I'll pay you Tuesday for a hamburger tomorrow.
That's it. I will pay you Tuesday for a hamburger tomorrow. Is about the summary of most of what's going on in Washington today. But my friends are emailing me and texting me by the hour saying, did you hear what happened? And I write back and I say, nothing happened. Somebody said something. Saying something is not happening. For example, there is no deal on the Dreamers. There's not a deal on the Dreamers until the Speaker of the House agrees to bring it to a vote, which he may not do. So now everybody's saying, well, that's over, let's move on to the next one. And I'm saying, nothing's happened. So you might as well listen to sports. Because the one great thing about sports is sports actually happens. You win or you lose the game, right? You win or you lose the game. It also is a way of keeping yourself from losing your mind. Because if you spend all of your time thinking about what a certain person says, you are going to lose your mind. There are people who just love to talk. And again, I grew up right outside New York. Donald Trump in New York is like one of 5 million people in New York, just like Donald Trump. For us, he's like, oh my God, I can't believe somebody talks like that. If he was in New York, he'd be about the 1 millionth ranking blowhard in the city of New York. which is why Chuck Schumer gets along so well with him. Because he's just known this guy. This is the way people talk in New York. But I'll tell you, in New York, people's actions don't match up to the way they talk, thank God. Now, I'm not saying that this guy has not taken a lot of actions that are disturbing, but I'd say about 70% of what has occurred since November has been words. And I go back to sticks and stones from when I was a kid. And I'm just trying to keep in my mind, I just hold my fire until I see what actually occurs. That's why the ACA was so important to me, the healthcare thing, because something could have actually happened. But it wasn't happening just because people were saying things were going to happen or something's going to happen at some later time. It's a way of saying keep yourself cool. Don't follow every twist and turn of the news because most of it is not really news. It's just talk. But watch for the actions. And then you'll be ready when an action occurs to take action. But right now, people are paralyzed by constantly reacting to what is said. And by the way, the subject changes every 5 minutes, so you can't keep any kind of consistent thought in your head. I keep in my mind, my lodestars are the following: healthcare, voting rights, and that's about it right now. Both of those are very serious problems that are under threat. I watch them very carefully, and I don't get distracted by every little thing that gets said. And I keep thinking, how are those two little ships going? Voting rights, healthcare. Voting rights, healthcare. Watch them all the time. And this gets to my last point, which is, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb?
But the light bulb really has to want to change. Yes.
Are we on the East Coast? Are we in the Catskills? I just have to know. This is like a great audience. Whatever I put out there, yes. It doesn't matter how many psychiatrists if the light bulb doesn't want to change. Very deep. With all the stuff we talk about, we should make it easier to vote. We need to get to where people are. We need to shame them. All this stuff gets rid of one basic thing about voting. The real hardcore of why people vote is because they care about something. And we don't control that. That's out of our hands. But it's the great missing piece, because if there's one thing you want to be able to do is find out where people are on things they care about and bring voting to that. So with young people, they get very angry when you give them. Have you given any young people the lecture about how you young people today? Can we just drop that? Oh, it's a waste of time. By the way, I got the same lecture. Now I get to do it. Every generation since Methuselah has said this younger generation just doesn't, I don't know, they just don't match up. They'll get angry at you and they'll say, what do you mean I don't care? I read everything about the environment. I read everything about police practices in cities. I read everything about housing. I'm reading everything about equal rights for women. I'm not voting. And before you freak out and reach over and grab them by the throat, take a step back for a second and say, you're actually 90% of the way there. You just don't know it. You just got to get in the last 10%. They don't like being told they don't care about issues, because when you read polls of non-voters, they have very strong opinions on issues. So take a step back and think about our approach, which is if somebody's hungry, they're ready, and you've got the thing that can make the difference, how do you deliver it to them to where they don't think you're a pain in the neck? You build on their interest. You sort of show it. You kind of make it happen. And we got a real object lesson in this with the Trump voters in 2016. And let me tell you something. Going into that election, Hillary Clinton had a massive get-out-the-vote operation around the country. It wasn't particularly effective, but it was certainly massive. You can honestly say that. Tons of people. They had everybody's phone number. They were calling them 20 times. They had analytics that were telling them what magazines they read and all this kind of stuff. They had everything amazing, and they had a disappointing turnout. The Trump campaign's get-out-the-vote operation, I think, consisted of 2 or 3 pickup trucks with some gun racks on the back, a few bottles, and that was it. They had no get-out-the-vote operation that anybody could see, which is one reason people guessed the result wrong.
A little moonshine.
Little moonshine, but I'll tell you something. Those people were motivated to vote, including people who had never voted before, and they walked themselves to the polls. Nobody called them. Nobody offered them a ride. Nobody said, let me make the case for the connection between what you care about. And this may be unwelcome news to people in the audience. It's actually unwelcome news to me, and here I am delivering it. It doesn't matter how many psychiatrists you have if the light bulb doesn't want to change. If the missing piece is inspiration, then all the work you do is not going to be all that effective except at the margins. But when you inspire, and I have to force the words out, but I'm going to. I watched this campaign very carefully, and what I could see is that there was only one candidate in either party, maybe one in the Democratic Party as well, somewhat elderly gentleman, who had built a connection with his base supporters such that when he opened his mouth, they nodded like they were at a religious service. And it was not Hillary Clinton, it was Donald Trump. And what he was saying, much of which I vociferously objected to, and still do to this day, I could feel it. I could feel the connection between him and the people in the room. Now, I've experienced that lots of times in politics. Barack Obama had that. John Kennedy had that. Now, to paraphrase Lloyd Benson, Donald Trump is no John Kennedy, substantively. But I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is that little extra piece where you don't have to call the people up and beg them to go vote. They just get up and say, which way is the voting booth? And they go there. Now, that piece is a little bit magical. That's kind of the magic of voting engagement. And we can't create that among ourselves. On the other hand, we can encourage it in our leaders. You know, and I spend a lot of my time giving imaginary advice to people in politics, which I then send off through brainwaves. One of them is you probably don't put out a new plan called A Better Deal, which was the Democratic Party's brilliantly inspirational program. I did find, however, it did solve some sleep problems I'd been having. I was able to read it shortly before going to bed, and it was extremely helpful to me. Inspiration can be taught. It can be encouraged. It can be asked for by us asking leaders to undertake that. And when you see it in action, even if it's something you don't agree with, you have got to notice that it walks people to the polls by itself. Look, why do people walk to the polls after 1994's passage of Prop 187? People felt a sense of threat. And 1 million new Latino voters entered the polls and entered the voting rolls in the decade of the 90s after that passed. Things happen in the world, and there are massive movements that we don't create. But I'll tell you, when they happen, we should be following them to that registration place and saying, now the next step is to vote. So my lessons before I take your questions are, we're in a crazy time, but it's also probably the greatest time for mobilizing people I've ever seen. And I think it's happening on all sides of the political spectrum. Now, all the commentators are saying, can't we go back to the time when things were more boring? I'm not for that. I'm for politics being about things that really matter, that we can fight over. As long as we're not physically fighting, there's no fight I can't accept in politics and think that it's a good way to get people going. Conflict gets people going. And I hear people saying, oh, can't we go back to bipartisanship? Certainly. That was very good in the 1940s when there was. But right now, that would be like saying, boy, I was going to watch that Mayweather fight. Can't these guys just get along? Oh, hi. I know we're going to have a boxing match today, but I don't know, can't we just cross the barriers between us? And you wanted to see a fight. Now, by the way, you did notice they were ragging on each other before the fight. Did you notice after the fight? They're best friends. That's how I feel. I play sports still at my advanced age, and we argue and we fight during the game, and afterwards everybody gets along great. Politics can be about a fight. It should be about a fight. If it's not about a fight, why are we wasting our time? The key to a successful democracy is for that fight never to become violent. But there should be no limit to what we're able to argue about. So I will say those are my modest thoughts about the future. I want you to charge out of here. I want you to go to the nearest saloon. Although a barber shop may be safer, I'll admit. I don't think, by the way, saloons are what they used to be. You know, in the old days, the bartender would give you advice, say, so what do you think about the election? And people listen in and all this. Nowadays, you go and you say, so what do you think about the election? And the guy pops you. If he gets his head up out of the glass he's got his head located in. But what's the equivalent of the saloon, I think, is worth our thinking about. And let's have some fun. Let's make this a social, truly engaging process. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I'll take any questions that anybody would like to ask.
Well, you can't take the mic off of there. You need to leave it. Because it's
What's our question plan here? If they yell it out, will it get picked up? Just yell. Yes, sir.
There's some,
And I'll repeat the question, too. That way you don't have to yell as
all
much.
right, well, or I can speak in here.
Nah, I'll repeat it.
Okay.
Don't mess with my territory. Yeah.
Okay, there's some big changes in California law that have passed in the last year or so.
Well, great question, which is how do all the reforms that are out there, and I'll go back to moving election dates, increasing vote by mail, going to voting centers more than having precincts, DMV registration. Look, there is no state anywhere that has tried to do as many things to remove the structural barriers to voting as California. Although there's a few that are a little bit ahead, which is automatic registration, which is still the single best thing, according to political scientists, that you could do, is just at the age of at 18, just register everybody who's a citizen. That's the single best thing you can do. These are all really good things. And by the way, Pasadena is wrestling with the moving of election dates issue. It's before the city council to decide what to do about that. Most of the evidence is that the voting turnout would be higher with even-numbered elections, but don't assume that will work as well in midterm elections. Because after all, if 31% turnout becomes the norm in LA County in the midterm, then that means the local election, it'll certainly help in the presidential election. It'll pull everything up. All these reforms are really good. I know that I said I like to go vote in the precinct. I still think at the end of the day, vote by mail is gonna be the way it's done. Although I think there should be more ways that people discuss what they're gonna do. I'm a little worried about the voting centers proposal because they may not have enough voting centers. And if those voting centers are not nearby, forget it. People are not gonna use it. They're beginning to do research on how far people are willing to walk or drive to vote. And let's just say, in our busy lives, it's going to be the thing that drops off the list of what you do if you have. And they have not dealt with the voting centers question, in my opinion. That's my biggest worry. Yes. Well, the question of what you call serial, I think not so much serial voting, but serial office holding, which is people are holding one office. They run for another office. So Jimmy Gomez leaves his assembly seat, gets elected to Congress, or actually, the congressional seat opens up. Jimmy Gomez runs for that seat. His assembly seat opens up, and now there's going to be an election that will probably lead to a runoff because there's so many candidates that no one will get a majority. We definitely have too many elections. In truth, I would be perfectly happy if the governor filled all vacancies until the next regularly scheduled election. I know it would drive people crazy, and it would seem like not a good thing to do, but what you really want to do is have the seat filled and then have an election. We now know, by the way, that just getting appointed to the seat does not guarantee your election. I mean, there's lots of times now where the person who gets appointed is not really capable of winning that election. We need fewer elections, and we certainly don't need standalone elections where there's not even a city election going on, there's not a county election, there's not a state election. The turnout is ridiculously low. So I think you've highlighted, that's a League of Women Voters problem, it seems to me. This is a job for the League of Women Voters. Too many, wouldn't it be funny? Wouldn't you love going on record as saying there's too many elections signed the League of Women Voters? That would get some attention. But I think it's a fixable problem. I think that's a good structural question. And we did this to ourselves with term limits, by the way. Remember, term limits was going to bring amateurs in? Well, that's happened in some offices. But the real thing is it means that the minute you win one office, rationally speaking, you got to be thinking about the next office. Loosening term limits would do wonders to reduce some of these problems, by the way. Yeah. Yes. Now the question, I hope everybody heard that in Oakland, where you were previously, the league focused on churches. Now, you end up with some fairly dicey questions, okay? It is not, there's all kinds of things going on in Washington, D.C. now about the political role that churches can take. Of course, the league is protected by being a nonpartisan organization, but the churches are not quite as comfortable being that setting in some cases. Now, we know that we did in our survey, we did surveys of Latinos and African Americans in LA County, and we're going to do a survey of African Americans. That's why I said Asian Americans and Latinos we did, and we're about to undertake an African American poll in LA County. And we're asking people about religion, because it turns out, first of all, to have a tremendous impact on their voting behavior. What a shock, what a total shock. By the way, it doesn't matter what religion. All that matters is how religious they are. It's called religiosity. But I would say that is a really important place where people are because of that. And we have become rather a secular society. And as a secular society, we tend not to think about it. Now, I will tell you that in all these communities, there's a kind of, don't expect anybody to immediately say, sure, come on over, because they're busy thinking about where politics, the law, the IRS, everything fits in with this. So it's no simple thing anymore. But you've probably hit the one thing that the most people go to on a regular basis. By the way, not everybody welcomes politics being brought into their religious service, you may note. And the pastor, the minister, the rabbi may find parishioners saying, we came here to get away from politics. Now, that's in different communities, there's a different attitude about that. Clearly, historically, in the African American community, the church is the single greatest pillar of political activity. And you are welcome to come. Candidates come through, especially on the Sunday before an election in LA City and County. It is a long-standing tradition. That's not as much of a tradition in the other communities, but I think it's a wonderful tradition. But it'd be interesting to see what happens if you call people and see what they say, see what their response is. Yes? Okay, so the question is, compared to the East Coast, where you may have more representatives per population than out here, does having 5 county supervisors create something of a problem? I don't know, gee, having 2 million constituents apiece? Seems reasonable to me. I think the problem is that the county is not really designed to be a representative institution. It's a mix of executive and legislative authority with the same people. There is a proposal in Sacramento, which I find I'm of two minds, which would expand the county board to 7 and put in an elected county executive. Now, I have personally and professionally supported that reform for years. The one wrinkle about this is every voter in California would get to vote on that measure. It would amend the California Constitution for only one of the 58 counties to have this form of government. It would not be passed by LA County voters. So, I've got two feelings. One is I kind of like the proposal. The other is I kind of like that LA County voters would get to decide how they're governed. I do look forward to the discussions in Inyo County of what should LA County do? I can't decide what's the best thing. I care so much about people in LA County and their democracy. On the other hand, LA County has resisted this for so many years. That might make some difference. I will tell you, the West Coast is far more hostile to large numbers of elected officials than the East Coast is. In 1989, New York City voters increased the size of the city council from 35 to 51, and it passed overwhelmingly. So when I worked on the city charter in LA, we put a measure on the ballot that would have increased the city council from 15 to 21. A few elected officials who were going to support the new city charter called us and said, if you put that on the ballot, I will withdraw my support for the city charter because my constituents will kill me. We got pollsters telling us that when they surveyed people about that, when they got to that question, the respondents, as they put it euphemistically, concluded the interview. They hung up. They were so angry at it. Now, that may be less true today. It's a different electorate today than it was in 1999. But out here, I've always believed that if we put a measure on the ballot that said all elected officials will be limited to 3 slices of bread a day and occasionally water, and nothing beyond that, and will be held against their will in their offices with no access to anyone, that it would pass with about 80% of the vote. We could include enhanced interrogation techniques. In fact, one of the tricks in California when you want to pass anything that elected officials like is you always put in something that makes their life more miserable. And then you make that the lead of it, that, you know, we're going to take away no tuna sandwiches to assembly members. People say, yeah, damn if I'm going to pay for tuna. So that's California for you. Yes?
I'm from Boston. So
Boston.
I've been in New York for a long time.
Okay, and I just want to talk a little bit about the Red Sox and the Patriots and other forces that need to be resisted at all times. Yes, go ahead. Okay, first of all, the questioner is from Boston. So I would like you to weigh these questions with that in mind, which means she roots for the Red Sox and the Patriots, not the Yankees and the Giants, which is who you're supposed to root for. So I just want to get that out first, just, you know, give some context to all this. I think your first question was about redistricting. Redistricting is the single most important thing at stake in the 2018 elections everywhere in the country and in the Supreme Court right now. In 2018, tremendous numbers of governorships are up. You don't have to win control of a state legislature to get an acceptable redistricting plan. You just need a governor who will veto an unacceptable plan. So if people say, what's the point of voting in 2018, redistricting is pretty close to the top of the list. There's also a very interesting proposal and movement being pursued by former Governor Schwarzenegger, which I actually think is not a bad idea, which is to go the California model of nonpartisan redistricting by a citizen commission, which I did a report on for the League of Women Voters of California and concluded that it worked pretty well in California. He's trying to get this idea sent around nationwide. The Supreme Court is about to consider a decision, to make a decision about whether partisanship should not be allowed as a criterion for redistricting. That would be a huge deal if they did. However, very sadly, they voted 5-4 a couple of days ago to say that racial discrimination is not enough to undo a Texas redistricting, which struck me as a decision that is literally indefensible. The partisan one, at least you could defend by saying the Constitution doesn't say anything about partisanship being unacceptable. I think it should be unacceptable, but you know, the Voting Rights Act and others are pretty clear about racial discrimination. So I'm very disheartened by that. I think that was, I know I'm supposed to be, I'm not supposed to say things like that. You said not to get too out of hand. Okay, I'm not going to get out of hand on that. Your second one was, I'm still thinking about the Boston thing, so I want to make sure I didn't miss. What was the second one? Oh, door-to-door. Door-to-door canvassing is enormously helpful in politics if you don't just limit it to the weekend before the election. And people like Anthony Thigpen, who's one of the best community organizers California has ever seen, has been operating on a principle called integrated voter contact, which is a simple way of saying we talk to you all year round. And face-to-face contact still is the single greatest way, but you're still getting people one at a time. So all I'm saying is take the face-to-face and make it more collective. But no, canvassing is a wonderful investment, but just ask yourself, give yourself a year and a half before the election, which it sounds like you're doing, because those folks, and Anthony's work is well worth supporting. And they do tremendous work. They ask people about their issues. They ask them what they care about. They talk to them. They come back and talk to them again, and then they come back and talk to them again. And you build a relationship. When I was in graduate school in New Haven, Connecticut, speaking of Connecticut, I went and volunteered on a Get Out the Vote drive. And they had relationships with the people they were bringing to the polls. And my job was to go up with them to the 4th floor of the apartment house and get them out and shove them downstairs to get into the car to go to the polls. So I'm with this guy, knocks on the door, Lucille! I hear this little voice, what? Who's that? It's Jerry from the party. He goes, oh, is it time to vote? I couldn't believe it. And about 30 seconds later, Lucille comes out with her coat on, with her purse, and I said, well, we're going to vote now. She says, I know. It's a relationship. We go down to the car, and my favorite thing is we go to the polls, we go in, Lucille votes, she goes back, I take her back upstairs, and she turns to me and she says, "Thank you, young man." It's like I had helped her do her duty. But she knew the guy who knocked on the door. She wasn't going to let me in. That's what you're trying to do there. Now, the third one is poor Hillary Clinton. I would not rule out, you can never rule out sexism in the way her book is being treated and her book tour is being treated. Let's get that out on the table. Men love to say women should shut up. And there's research on this, by the way. I mean, there is actually research on this. How many people interrupt each other? Who interrupts? Who gets away with interrupting? You'll have a panel on women's rights that consists of 15 men. Those always make wonderful pictures. As a man, I can tell you what women need. You know, in politics, they need, here's my list of it makes you nuts. That's all true. Okay. But may I say, my heart did not leap when I heard that Hillary Clinton was going to come out with a book in which she answered the question of what happened in 2016. And my heart leapt less when I heard some of the excerpts from it. I did a little bit better when I heard the interviews and she got to talk about it a little bit more. And then it's got some hope. You know, there's the male-female thing, and then there's the Clinton and the rest of the world thing. The Clintons and the rest of the world. I love Bill and Hillary Clinton, what they've accomplished. They're phenomenally talented people. But if you've ever heard the phrase, "it's all about you," it could have been invented for Bill and Hillary Clinton. You could argue that what happened in November had amazing consequences for us, for like the rest of the world, but I can't shake the feeling that Bill and Hillary sit up at night and say, oh, we're really hurt. This is really bad. But it's not entirely my fault, but I take full responsibility. By the way, I heard her say yesterday, I take full responsibility. Anytime anyone in politics takes full responsibility, they are not taking full responsibility. They always say, 20 things happened that were not my responsibility, but hey, I was the candidate. I take full responsibility. Actually, it's never true that you're, anyway, so I get a little worn out, and I think Democrats are particularly disheartened by her relitigating the Bernie Sanders versus Hillary debate, which has worn out people beyond description. You know, when you lose, sometimes it pays to kind of take some time off and not write your book right away. So I don't want to be too hard on her. I admire her greatly, and I factor in the fact that it's a woman writing the book who's going to get dismissed by the kind of largely male-dominated opinion world. I think that there's a lot to that. I think I'm being booted off the stage. I just, you know, I don't know what it is, even though I'm from New Jersey and therefore lack sensitivity, I am able to see when my time is up. So I just want you to know that when I moved to California in the 70s, I really was a New Yorker, and I would carry on both ends of every conversation. Because people took so damn long to answer a question like, how are you? They would think about it. Or they would tell me how they really are, about which I couldn't give a rat's ass. I'd say, how are you? And they go, well, my job is pretty good. It's not quite what it was. I'm thinking, when will this end? So I got in the habit of saying, how are you? You look good. It moved things along. But my breakthrough was somebody said to me, Rafe, I just have to tell you, here in California, we usually allow people to answer a question before the next comment is made. And this hit me like a ton of bricks. I had never considered this possibility of actually listening to the entire thing the other person said. And I have become a highly sensitive person. It's also true that in the first month, I was in the left turn lane on Wilshire Boulevard downtown, and the light turned green. Now, any self-respecting New Yorker knows you go, because these other fools are coming and they're not hitting their gas. A little motorcycle comes up with an officer, and I looked at him, and he was the fittest looking officer I'd ever seen in my life. On the East Coast, you always know if you run, ain't nobody gonna catch you. they're going to like wait for the officer on the next block, to try to trip you or something. And he said that I was in violation of Motor Vehicle Code Section 401.3. And I thought, damn, nobody talks like that on the East Coast. They just say, hey. And he gave me a ticket. And I went to court. And I said that I was new to town, and where I come from in my country, we can make that turn. And there were like hundreds of people there. It was a typical LA scene. People had brought their like posters to show that they were right, and it was a very LA scene. And the judge looked at me, and I became quite the hero. He said, young man, I'm gonna eliminate this ticket. And there was a gasp in the audience, and he said, but you're living in our town now, and you need to follow our rules. And I said, Your Honor, okay. I think I'm done.
I do want to point out that Dr. Sonenshein had made a point of telling me that he needed to leave at 10. I'd love to have him talk longer. But we'd like to present him with a copy of the lead Defender of Democracy.
I love it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful.